I came home expecting to hear the familiar rattle of my garage door, maybe catch the smell of old motor oil still hanging in the Arizona heat. But instead, all I heard was silence, then the crunch of broken concrete under my boots. 6 hours? That's all I was gone. 6 hours at a routine appointment with the Veterans Affairs Clinic. And somehow that was enough time for someone to erase 27 years of my life. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 53 years old, a Desert Storm veteran, retired diesel mechanic, and until that afternoon, I honestly believed that if you stayed out of other people's business, they'd eventually stay out of yours too. Turns out I was wrong. I bought my little quarter-acre place on the edge of Mesa back in 1997, long before anyone dreamed of turning the surrounding desert into luxury subdivisions with fake lakes, palm trees hauled in from California, and houses so big people needed golf carts just to visit their neighbors. My place wasn't impressive, never tried to be. Small ranch house, faded red barn-style garage, chain-link fence I'd replaced with cedar years earlier, a couple mesquite trees that somehow survived every brutal summer, and a workshop that became my whole world after I retired. Some guys spend retirement on cruise ships or golf courses. I spent mine rebuilding old pickups, Jeeps, and motorcycles for veterans who couldn't afford repairs anymore. Sometimes I'd charge them for parts if they insisted. Most of the time I'd just shake my head and tell them to buy me coffee someday. It wasn't charity, at least not the way I saw it. It was purpose. After the military, purpose becomes harder to find than people think. The garage gave me that back. For nearly 3 decades, nobody bothered me. My neighbors waved when they drove by. Kids rode bicycles through the street. Everybody minded their own business, and life stayed blessedly. Then developers found our side of town. Within 2 years, empty desert turned into gated neighborhoods with names like Silver Ridge Estates and Canyon Preserve, names that sounded expensive enough to justify charging $500,000 for houses built 15 feet apart. Eventually, one of those neighborhoods wrapped itself around my property like ivy around an old tree. They called it Ironwood Reserve. That's when I first met Melissa Grant. She was president of their homeowners association, successful real estate broker, always dressed like she was on her way to a television interview, smiling with her mouth, but never with her eyes. The first conversation we ever had lasted maybe 40 seconds. She walked up while I was sanding the hood of a '69 Chevy pickup and looked around without even introducing herself. "You know," she finally said, "your property doesn't really fit the image we're trying to create here." I laughed because I honestly thought she was joking. Good thing I wasn't trying to match it, I told her. She didn't laugh back. She just smiled that thin little smile and said, "We'll be talking again." She kept that promise. About 2 weeks later, I found my first violation notice taped to the front door. Apparently, my American flag was mounted 2 inches lower than their guidelines preferred. Funny thing was, I wasn't even part of their HOA. I tossed the paper into the trash. Then came another notice. My fence was allegedly too tall. Another one claimed automotive equipment was visible from neighboring properties. Another said my detached workshop didn't meet community appearance standards. Every envelope demanded money. $500, $1,200, $2,000. Before long, they'd invented nearly $19,000 in fines against a man they had absolutely no legal authority over. Friends told me to hire an attorney immediately. I didn't. Looking back, maybe that was pride. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe after serving overseas, I'd simply run out of patience for people who confused paperwork with power. I already knew something Melissa apparently didn't. My property existed long before Ironwood Reserve. My deed clearly stated the parcel predated any future community restrictions, and an attorney had explained years earlier that those protections were rock solid. I figured eventually she'd realize she was wasting everyone's time. Instead, every ignored notice seemed to make things more personal. She'd drive slowly past my house in her white SUV, staring at the garage while workers trimmed bushes around homes that all looked exactly the same. One Saturday, I overheard her telling a prospective buyer, "Don't worry, we're handling the eyesore." She wasn't talking about an abandoned building or a junkyard. She was talking about my home. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it hurt my feelings, but because I suddenly understood this had never been about rules. It was about control. My garage reminded her she couldn't control everything she could see, and people like Melissa hated unfinished business. Still, I never imagined she'd actually do something irreversible. The morning everything changed started like any other. I grabbed coffee before sunrise, locked the garage, patted the hood of an old Ford Bronco I'd almost finished restoring for a Marine who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan, then headed to my VA appointment thinking I'd be back before lunch. I had absolutely no idea that while I was sitting in a waiting room discussing blood pressure medication, someone was already making the decision that would destroy my workshop, ignite a legal war neither side would ever forget, and uncover a 70-year-old secret buried inside my property's original deed that would change both our lives forever. I was gone just a little over 6 hours. The waiting room at the VA was packed that morning and appointments always seemed to run behind. So by the time I turned onto my street, the afternoon sun was baking everything in sight, except something immediately felt wrong. There wasn't a single truck parked in front of my place. No saws buzzing, no workers loading equipment, nothing at all. Just an empty stretch of road and a cloud of pale dust still drifting through the air like whatever had happened had only ended minutes earlier. Then I saw it, my garage, or at least what was left of it. The roof was gone. The walls were nothing more than broken piles of concrete blocks and splintered lumber. My workbench was crushed beneath twisted steel beams. Toolboxes lay split open with sockets and wrenches scattered everywhere. And the old Bronco I'd spent nearly a year rebuilding for Sergeant Mike Callahan looked like somebody had dropped a building on top of it, because somebody had. For a long moment, I couldn't even move. I just stood there listening to the wind blow across the rubble, trying to convince myself I was looking at the wrong house. Then I spotted a bright yellow envelope taped to the surviving fence post. Unauthorized accessory structure removed in accordance with community enforcement action. No signature, just Ironwood Reserve HOA printed neatly across the bottom. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my brain refused to process something that insane. They hadn't fined me. They hadn't sued me. They hadn't even called the county. They had hired a demolition crew to destroy a building sitting entirely on property they didn't own. My neighbor Frank walked across the street before I could even speak. He looked sick. "Ethan, I tried to stop them," he said quietly. "They showed up around 10 with excavators. I asked where the permit was. One of the supervisors said Melissa handled everything and they had authorization." "Did nobody call the police?" I asked. Frank looked embarrassed. "Couple people did, but by the time anyone arrived, the crew was already packing up. They said it looked like a civil matter." I climbed over chunks of concrete, searching for anything salvageable. Every few feet I'd recognize something. My father's old vise crushed in half. The welding helmet I'd bought after retiring from the army. Shelves full of carefully labeled engine parts buried beneath bricks. Dozens of handwritten notebooks containing restoration measurements soaked by a broken water line. They hadn't simply demolished a garage. They had erased decades of memories. That night I couldn't sleep. I spread every property document I owned across my kitchen table looking for something, anything, that might help. Survey maps, tax records, insurance paperwork, old photographs, closing documents from 1997. Around midnight, I unfolded the original warranty deed I'd barely looked at in years. It was older than every other document, yellow around the edges, typed on paper that smelled like history more than paperwork. I started reading every paragraph carefully instead of skimming like I'd always done before. Then I stopped. There it was, buried almost 3 pages in, attached as an addendum recorded in 1948. Apparently the original owner of the property, a World War II Army engineer named Walter Jennings, had negotiated a permanent covenant with the county after donating part of his ranch for a veterans rehabilitation program. One sentence practically jumped off the page. "Any future owner who is an honorably discharged United States military veteran shall retain unrestricted residential use of said parcel free from any private covenant, homeowners association regulation, or subsequent neighborhood restriction." I read it 3 more times just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. It wasn't some vague grandfather clause. It wasn't open to interpretation. It specifically protected veteran ownership from private associations forever. I drove to my attorney's office the moment they opened. Claire Morrison had represented me years earlier during a property boundary issue, and I'd never seen her lose her composure until she finished reading that deed. She leaned back in her chair, removed her glasses, and simply said, "They have absolutely no idea what they've done." By lunchtime, she had emergency filings prepared, preservation orders requested, and a certified demand letter on its way to Melissa's office, complete with copies of the deed, survey maps, photographs, and notice that every additional action taken against me would now become evidence. We honestly believed that would end it. Surely once their attorney saw the documents. Someone would tell Melissa to apologize before this turned catastrophic. 3 days passed. Nothing. No apology. No phone call. No acknowledgement that the certified letter had even been opened. Instead, another violation notice appeared on my mailbox demanding I remove remaining construction debris because it negatively affected neighborhood appearance. I carried that paper straight into Claire's office. She didn't even bother hiding her disbelief anymore. She's either unbelievably arrogant, Claire muttered, or nobody has shown this to her. Maybe she thinks she can bully me into giving up, I answered. Claire smiled without humor. Then, let's make this public. A local television reporter named Kevin Rhodes agreed to stop by after hearing that a veteran's workshop had been destroyed. He expected to film a damaged shed. Instead, he found veterans from around the county helping me dig through rubble searching for donated wheelchairs, adaptive vehicle parts, and restoration projects that had been buried beneath concrete. Mike Callahan stood beside the smashed Bronco staring silently before saying into the camera, "This truck would have been my first chance to drive myself in 4 years." That sentence spread across social media faster than anything I'd ever witnessed. By evening, local Facebook groups exploded. Veterans organizations shared the footage. Radio stations picked it up. Complete strangers showed up bringing bottled water, gloves, and food, while volunteers helped recover whatever little remained. Melissa finally called the next afternoon. "Mr. Brooks," she began, that polished business voice I'd heard before. "I think emotions have gotten out of hand. Perhaps we should discuss a reasonable settlement." I looked across my destroyed garage before answering. The time for discussion ended when your excavator hit my wall. "We were acting in the community's best interests," she insisted. "No," I replied calmly. "You were acting in your own." Then I hung up. That's when anger gave way to something colder. Patience. If Melissa believed this fight was only about one demolished garage, she still hadn't realized I'd spent 22 years as a military mechanic, where attention to detail wasn't optional. Every tiny mistake mattered. Every overlooked bolt could cost lives. So, over the next several weeks, I borrowed a drone from one of the younger veterans, obtained public county records, compared approved permits against visible construction throughout Ironwood Reserve, and slowly discovered something remarkable. The same HOA that claimed to worship rules had quietly ignored dozens of violations committed by its wealthiest homeowners. Swimming pools built without permits, retaining walls extending into drainage easements, oversized fences, illegal guest houses, enclosed patios never inspected, even several additions sitting beyond recorded setback lines. I photographed every single one, matched addresses with county files, organized everything into neat binders exactly the way we prepared maintenance reports in the Army, then delivered the entire package to county code enforcement. And within 2 weeks, bright orange violation notices started appearing all over Ironwood Reserve like autumn leaves after a storm. While Melissa stood in the middle of her perfectly manicured neighborhood watching inspectors knock on door after door, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized the balance of power had finally started to shift. Melissa called again 3 days after the county inspectors started making their rounds. Only this time, there wasn't a trace of confidence left in her voice. "Ethan, we've had some misunderstandings," she said carefully, choosing every word like she was walking across broken glass. "The board would like to resolve this before things get any further." I leaned against the temporary fence surrounding what used to be my garage and watched volunteers frame the foundation for a new workshop while answering her with the calmest voice I could manage. "Funny, when I asked for common sense, you sent a bulldozer. Now you're asking me for mercy?" She went quiet for a second before trying again. "We're prepared to offer compensation. Then you can offer it in court," I replied. And that was the last conversation we ever had. A month later, we walked into the courthouse. And despite everything people imagine about lawsuits, there wasn't anything glamorous about it. It smelled like old paper, stale coffee, and worn-out carpet. Melissa arrived surrounded by attorneys carrying expensive leather briefcases, while I showed up with Claire, a banker box full of documents, and several veterans who insisted on sitting behind me simply because they wanted me to know I wasn't standing there alone. The courtroom became strangely quiet once the judge entered. He was an older man with silver hair, and before the proceedings even began, he noticed the small service pin on my jacket. During a break, he quietly mentioned he'd served with the Marines decades earlier. He didn't smile, didn't hint at how he might rule, but I remember thinking maybe, just maybe, he'd understand that this case wasn't really about a garage anymore. Claire presented the original deed first, walking the judge through every page until she reached the covenant protecting future veteran owners. Then came photographs showing the workshop before demolition, followed by drone footage, county records, copies of every violation notice, certified letters Melissa ignored, and finally the television interview showing disabled veterans digging through broken concrete searching for equipment that had been donated to them. Melissa's attorney tried arguing they believed the structure violated neighborhood standards, but the judge stopped him halfway through one sentence. "Standards do not create ownership," he said evenly. "An association cannot exercise authority over property it does not legally control." You could almost feel the room shift. Then Melissa herself took the stand. Claire asked one simple question. "Before ordering demolition, did you personally verify whether Mr. Brooks' property was subject to your association's governing documents?" Melissa hesitated just long enough for everyone in the courtroom to notice. "I relied on information provided by our compliance committee." Claire nodded once. "So the answer is no." That single exchange seemed to drain whatever confidence Melissa had left. The ruling came 2 weeks later, and honestly, even Claire admitted it exceeded her expectations. The court awarded full replacement costs for my workshop, every destroyed tool, the damaged Bronco restoration, emotional damages tied to the unlawful destruction, and reimbursement for legal expenses. But because the demolition permanently interfered with protected property rights attached to the deed, the judge imposed something none of us had anticipated. Ironwood Reserve would owe me a permanent monthly easement payment for as long as the Homeowners Association existed, compensation recognizing that they had unlawfully entered and altered protected veteran property. Miss a payment, interest would begin accumulating immediately, and additional enforcement actions could include liens against association-owned assets. The courtroom stayed completely silent while the order was read. Melissa looked like she couldn't quite believe what she'd heard. 3 weeks later, she resigned as HOA president. By the end of the summer, her house was listed for sale, and before the first anniversary of the demolition, she had moved out of Arizona altogether. As for me, I rebuilt the workshop, only this time stronger than before, with reinforced concrete walls, better equipment, and enough room for 3 restoration projects instead of 1. Above the new garage door, I mounted a simple wooden sign that read, "Built again with honor." I didn't need anything louder than that. Every month, right on schedule, another payment arrives from the same association that once insisted my home lower their property values. I deposit the check, walk into my workshop, and use part of that money to keep repairing vehicles for veterans who need a hand getting back on the road. In a strange way, the people who tried hardest to erase that part of my life ended up funding it instead. I never wanted revenge. I wanted accountability. There's a difference. And I think too many communities forget that once power starts feeling more important than people. Looking back now, I don't hate Melissa or even the HOA. I think they made the mistake a lot of people make when they're surrounded by rules long enough. They started believing rules mattered more than fairness, and authority mattered more than humility. They saw an old garage and assumed they were looking at a nuisance. What they were really looking at was a veteran's purpose, a place where broken machines and sometimes broken people got a second chance. So now I want to hear from you. If you were in my shoes, would you have accepted a settlement and moved on? Or would you have taken the fight all the way to court like I did? And do you think the HOA got exactly what it deserved? Or did the punishment go too far? Share your honest opinion in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I genuinely like to know where you stand.